Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay, but we're ready now. The land on which the University of Toronto operates has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. My name is Gordon Davies. I'm the Program Director for Languages and Arts and Science at the University Toronto School of Continuing Studies. And it's my great privilege to have this Alan Toff annual lecture as part of my portfolio. Welcome to it today. The first welcome has to go to Alan Toff himself, who is sitting very modestly towards the back. He will be introduced more fully in a moment. Our dean will introduce him. Welcome to the students of the University Lecture Series, many of whom I see here, and to others from among the 20,000 students who form the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies, and to the school's many friends from across the university community. We are videotaping and live streaming this hour, so welcome to our online guests as well. I will introduce our speaker in a minute, but first of all, our Dean, Dr. Maureen MacDonald, will say a few words.
Good afternoon. As Gordon said, my name is Maureen MacDonald, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the School of Continuing Studies here at the University of Toronto. It's wonderful to see such a large crowd at this year's Alan Toff Art Lecture. I'd like to extend a personal welcome to Alan and his guests this afternoon. The School of Continuing Studies has a long history of being an integral part of the University of Toronto. Our 685 courses and more than 100 certificates complement the teaching and research mandates of the University of Toronto. As many of you in this room know, the University Lecture Series is one of our most popular programs. In fact, it has been offered for over 4 decades, making it our longest running program. The annual series offers an eclectic mix of subjects across a broad spectrum of topics ranging from history, politics, science, culture, architecture, and sociology. Since 2015, the Alan Toff Lecture Series has been offered as part of the University Lecture Series. And we are so thrilled to be able to open up participation in this event this year to a much wider audience. Today represents our 4th annual Alan Toff Art Lecture. For those of you that didn't have the pleasure of meeting him in the classroom, Mr. Toff was a beloved visual arts instructor at SCS for more than 30 years. Now retired from teaching, we are proud that his legacy continues, thanks to an anonymous donor who created the Alan Toff Lecture Series. To Mr. Toff, thank you for continuing to be such a committed member of our learning community. And to all of you, thank you for being here today and for dedicating the next hour to your own lifelong journey. I hope to see you all again very soon.
Our guest lecturer today is well known for his provocative reinterpretation of romantic North American landscapes. He explores themes of colonization, sexuality, loss, and resilience, the complexities of historic and contemporary Indigenous experience in a variety of mediums, including painting, film and video, performance, and installation. His glamorous, gender-fluid alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testickle, appears in much of his work as a time-traveling, shape-shifting, supernatural being who reverses the colonial gaze, upending received notions of history and Indigenous people. With Miss Chief at center stage, our guest has created memorable site-specific performances at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and the Denver Art Gallery. His work has been exhibited internationally and is widely represented in the collection of major museums in Canada and the US. His second national touring solo exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, A Story of Resilience, will visit museums across Canada until 2020. Please welcome Kent Monkman.
Winnipeg, and I've been living in Toronto for about 30 years. And I left Winnipeg as just after high school. I wanted to pursue my career as an artist here in Toronto. Can we get the lights down so that we have a better view of this screen, please? Turn them all off. It's okay. Getting there. Keep going. There we go. Keep going. Better? More? More? Okay, so I guess that's what we're stuck with. Is that okay? Okay, good. So, you know, when I set out to become a painter, to become a visual artist, I knew I had to fit myself into this canon of art history. And I think that's the challenge for any young artist, is where do you fit into this sometimes overwhelming and very intimidating trajectory of art history, which is, you know, many thousands of years old, no matter which community or culture you're from. And so I set out on a path to try and figure out what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. This painting, which is the title of my lecture today, is called History is Painted by the Victors. And it's a painting in which Miss Chief has as her subjects a number of different male nudes, and she's making her own painting of them in her own style, which is kind of looks a lot like a ledger drawing style. And they're spread out, sprawled around on this shore in front of her. And those male figures are based mostly on the paintings of Thomas Eakins, who was an American 19th century artist, and he's kind of known for his photography and his painting. So that's one thing I do, is I really engage with art history, and I kind of come at art history from a number of different perspectives. And the main point is to really challenge the subjectivity of the art history of North America as it was told by European settlers. So how did I get here? This is not something you just kind of like jump at and arrive at. There's a process to getting there, and I want to talk a bit about that process today because, you know, as a young artist, you kind of explore and you try and find your way to find a unique way of creating your own vision. And I want to talk about this series specifically because this series was kind of the culmination of many years of painting as an abstract painter, actually. I was pushing paint around in my studio for about 12 or 15 years before I kind of turned back to representational work. I trained as an illustrator, and I thought that, you know, representational work was kind of a bit passé. You know, I thought the highest form of painting was the work of the abstract expressionist. So I was kind of buying into this very limited part of art history, which was really the work of these white male macho guys from New York. And I believed that I had, you know, as a painter, as an artist, I had to find my own way of making a unique mark on the canvas, which is fine, which is great. So that's what I set out to do. And over many years, I finally found this series of paintings, which I called the prayer language. Now, at that time, I was also really wanting to explore issues of my own identity, being Indigenous, being Cree, being from Manitoba, being queer, and wanting to deal with aspects of colonization, you know, mostly trying to understand why, you know, we have homophobia in our communities, knowing that in our communities, you know, pre-contact, there was respect for the other gendered people, the people who were of the third gender. There was respect and there was a space for other sexualities. It wasn't just this kind of binary that the Europeans understood. So I wanted to deal with that. So these paintings were created through dripping paint. I was pouring paint, moving it around with squeegees, and the language that you see there is the Cree language. It's in a form of writing called the Cree syllabics. And beneath those layers, I was, painting these images that to represent two figures struggling or wrestling. And they were, inspired by these photographs, these homoerotic photographs of men wrestling. So I like that idea of this tension, the struggle beneath these layers of Cree text. Now, all of the Cree, each Cree painting here is the kind of, it's inscribed, there's a different hymn used for each painting, so a Christian hymn. So here I was also referencing the impact of Christianity in the colonization of First Nations people. So I really wanted to introduce the impact of the church on our communities, through residential schools, and the impact of Christian values on Indigenous sexuality. And the paintings got bigger. So this painting here is about 7 by 11 feet, and I remember having so much fun in my studio because I had scaffolds set up, and the paintings were horizontal, and I was like crawling around on scaffolds and pouring paint and letting it dry just the right amount, and then I'd pull it all off with a squeegee, and I was getting these beautiful kind of translucent layers of paint, which was very satisfying in the sense of I had finally found, a very unique way of making a mark with paint. And so in that sense, I felt like I had achieved, my goal. But I found at the end of this series that these paintings were just too cryptic. The language was too personal. And I realized that abstract painting and the language of abstract painting was a very personal language. Sure, you could sort of, express a mood or a feeling. You could work with color and these different sort of formal aspects of painting, which were, which is all part of painting. But at the end of the day, here I had made this beautiful series of paintings, and people would look at them and go, "Oh, that's really, interesting," but kind of glazing over because they couldn't really pick up on these other themes that I was really going for, which were much more, they were just heavier themes that really dealt with colonization and colonized sexuality. So I thought, well, I've achieved my personal drip, but I've failed to communicate. And I realized that I wanted to communicate. I wanted to talk about these themes that were very important to me and to my own community. So as I do with many works, I kind of go back to the drawing board, and this is where I kind of went to a watercolor to try and figure out, who are those figures? It didn't take very long for that one figure to become a dark-skinned figure and the other figure to be white. And now you can see the introduction of a landscape. And then I realized really the conflict I was talking about here was about European settler cultures and Indigenous cultures, and this conflict, at the root of the conflict was the conflict over land. The fact that Europeans came in larger and larger numbers and dispossessed Indigenous people to smaller and smaller tracts of lands, and really at the crux of colonization was the dispossession of my people and Indigenous people from our lands. So with that in mind, I thought I need to look at the landscape painting of this continent to find out what that story really is about. And it's a very subjective story. It's a very subjective lens, the European lens with their eye, the settlers with their eye on the North American landscape, often obliterating Indigenous people. So here I still have this very graphic style. You can see that the Cree syllabics have now disappeared, and you have a English text, and I was looking for these very racist and kind of violent passages in pulp Western novels and transcribing those. And then I was now looking at the group of 7 paintings because they're so graphic, and it was very easy to adapt their paintings to this very graphic style with the text. So the more I looked into art history, the more interesting it got. And then I remember seeing this painting, and it's called Daniel Boone's First View of the Kentucky Valley. And I thought, wow, oh my gosh, this is kind of registering those themes, you know, the impact of Christianity. It's very much about, you know, the European settler kind of coming out and surveying the empty landscape and taking possession of it. And it's beautifully painted. It's in the Romantic style. And I remember looking at that and just thinking, I need to kind of disappear my hand. I had spent so many years trying to make that mark that was unmistakably my own mark, and now I realized that this canon of art history, I kind of wanted to go into stealth mode and enter that art history to challenge these narratives. So all that training that I'd had as a representational painter, I had rejected and spent all those years making abstract paintings, and so I just thought, well, I'm going to go back to those foundational skills and see if I can do this. So this was the first painting I made, tiny little painting. This is also called Daniel Boone's First View of the Kentucky Valley. And it's, you know, it's a tiny little painting. It's about 8 by 10 inches, and I was kind of coming into it a bit timidly. You can see that there's still this ghosting of the text over the surface of the canvas. And I remember just looking at that and going, I don't need the text anymore. I don't need the heavy-handedness, the style of the artist doesn't need to be there anymore. Just forget that and disappear my hand into the work. And that's when I started to pursue, you know, a much more directed program to really emulate the style of these painters from the 19th century who were making paintings of Indigenous people telling the European settler version of art history, and at the expense of, you know, obliterating Indigenous narratives from art history altogether. So this is Albert Bierstadt, and Albert Bierstadt, you know, was known for these very grandiose, very romantic landscapes with tiny little people in them, sort of running, you know, along the bottom of the painting. And here's a painting of some Indigenous folk bringing, you know, their canoes onto the shoreline. But then, you know, when I saw that painting, you could also see it has this almost biblical quality. You could see, you know, God shining out of the heavens. So in a way, I'd kind of come back full circle, and I was able to address these paintings and still address the ideology behind these paintings. So the Christian intentions in this work were there. So I was able to still communicate the themes of the impact of Christianity on Indigenous communities. So the Hudson River School included artists like Thomas Cole. So here we have, you know, this, I don't know, he lived in upstate New York. I guess this is what upstate New York looks like. It's the Garden of Eden. And then the more I looked at, you know, their work, the more interesting it got, just in terms of like who these individuals were, right? So I was like, okay, who are these guys, and what were they thinking, and what was their agenda? So the more I looked, the more interesting it got, and just in terms of their personal agenda. This is John McStanley, and here he is. He's painting himself. He's painted himself into this scene where he's, you know, hunting bison, and he's, you know, kind of made this image of himself as this kind of rugged hunter. George Catlin has been described as my nemesis by a curator friend of mine. George Catlin, here he is making a painting of himself, making a painting of a Mandan chief. So I realized at that point I needed a persona, my own persona, that could live inside the work and reverse the gaze. I wanted a character that could live inside the work and turn that gaze back on the Europeans to challenge their story, to create an Indigenous perspective on art history. So I looked to the traditions of our Indigenous, our own Two-Spirit traditions within many different cultures across North America. And Wewa was a Zuni who biologically male but lived in the female role. And you know, she had a very important position in her nation and represented her people at Washington. And so Wewa was my kind of role model for that persona that I wanted to present in the paintings, because this person, you know, straddled, you know, was represented the third gender, was neither male nor female, and represented that idea of empowered Indigenous sexuality. So Miss Chief was created, and Miss Chief Eagle Testickle, obviously a play on the word mischief and egotistical. So here's the artist. front and center in her own work, taking over center stage, kind of turning her eye on the European himself. So the inspiration for her first outfit came from none other than Cher. And I grew up, you know, in the 60s and 70s in Winnipeg watching Sonny and Cher show. And I, of course, loved Cher, and it was very glamorous to see this outfit. And I thought that's exactly what Miss Chief is going to wear, because I also wanted her to sort of, at first glance, blend with that sort of period look of the paintings that I was dealing with. But then the more I sort of explored the history of Native American Indigenous performance art culture, I came across Molly Spotted Elk, who was a Penobscot woman who was dancing in Paris in the early 20th century, and this is what she looked like. So in fact, Cher was nowhere near the first to kind of dress like that. So here Miss Chief has her subject, this kind of cowboy, Saint Sebastian, and Miss Chief was born. And I, at that moment, realized, you know, the more I can sort of submerge my own hand, the more effective these paintings are going to be in terms of, you know, people sort of looking at them and then having to take a second glance at it, right? So it wasn't long after those paintings were made that I realized that Miss Chief had to exist as a performance persona as well. And so that was kind of the birth of my career as a performance artist. And I guess I was always a closet performer, because this was kind of the moment for that other form of expression to come out. And the first time that Miss Chief appeared was at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, and she made paintings of these two European males and dressed them up to look more authentic. And this was all, her text was based on the texts of George Catlin and Paul Kane, who always complained about not finding enough authentic looking Native people, whether it was around the city of York, where Paul Kane lived. So this brings me to, we're going to fast forward through a whole bunch of paintings that I did in that period in between 2003 up to about 2017 or so, because this painting here is a Spanish history painting that I saw in the Prado probably about 6 years ago, and I was there with my good friend and collaborator Giselle Gordon. I'll talk a little bit more about her work and my work later, but we stood in front of that painting, and it really blew me away. It was partly the scale of it. It was a massive history painting. It's probably about that size. And the effect of the artist to be able to communicate so many different themes and narratives in this one painting, you know, grief, fear, you know, human emotion, the political act of these men being executed, the quietness of that composition, just the look in their eyes, you know, there were so many things about that painting that made me realize that painting had the enormous potential to communicate across time. You know, this painting was made 150 years ago, and it just sort of reached out and grabbed me by the throat, and I was really taken aback by it, and thought, that's what I need to do. I need to get my paintings to this point, because I know that there are so many Indigenous histories that have been erased from this European settler history that need to be authorized into art history. And they need to have that importance. They need to have that weight of a history painting to carry that message out, not just now, but 150 years from now, so that 150 years from now, people will look back and say, these things happened. And so that was the moment. It was sort of this wonderful epiphany, but it was also a little intimidating, because I thought, you know, I've been working with these landscapes, been, you know, working with Bierstadt's landscapes, I've been copying them, but the figures were always kind of small, and I thought, how do I get my practice up? How do I get my game up as a painter to execute this? So that became my challenge over the next few years, and you know, I've had a team of assistants helping me for, well, I guess I hired my first assistant probably in 2006, and I've been building my team over a period of time. We're at 12 right now. Sometimes I think that it's a bit much, but it's it's amazing to have a team support you, and you know, I train my painters. So we've got 6 painters in my studio right now, as well as other assistants in different supporting roles. But I realized, you know, at one other point I was in the Louvre, and I remember going through the Rubens room, you know, these paintings that had been commissioned by Catherine de Medici, and it was this just astonishing, you know, series of paintings, massive paintings, all made within 4 years. And I just remember being blown away by that, and completely, it was staggering just what this artist was able to accomplish. And I thought, how does an artist do that? Well, an artist has an atelier, they have a team of assistants. But how do they all end up looking the same? So this is what I've been figuring out in my own studios, that yes, you know, I'm the master artist that has many apprentices, and they work in my studio and I train them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that process is in terms of how my assistants work with me. And then I'll talk a bit about shame and prejudice, and that'll bring us up to, oh my gosh, we have 10 more minutes? How much do we have to say on time here? Keep going, okay. I'll just talk fast. Anyway, so this is Death of the Virgin by Caravaggio, and I was approached by about 4 years ago by Barbara Fisher here at University of Toronto Art Museum, and she said, I would like to do I would like you to do an exhibition to kind of respond to Canada 150, and I just jumped at that opportunity because in the back of my mind I thought, here is a chance to actually do these history paintings that can respond to the history of this continent and go directly into the museums. Barbara wanted it to be a museum project, so working with the collections of Canadian museums. We went to about 12 different museums, dug around in their storage drawers, and found all kinds of material, and then this exhibition was a result of about a year of research. So I love Caravaggio. This is a painting I've seen many times. It's in the Louvre, and you know, I was really struck by the emotion. Again, the emotion. His Death of the Virgin, the death of a young woman. So I was thinking about missing and murdered Indigenous women. I was thinking about teen suicide in our communities. And so for me, this painting really resonated in terms of one of the histories that I wanted to talk about in Shame and Prejudice. So this is a pencil sketch that kind of adapts the composition from Caravaggio. It's, you know, tiny. Again, it's like a little thumbnail sketch about that big. But it kind of works out all the compositional elements that are there. So one of the things that happened in my studio as a result of working with collaborators in my studio is that they always have their eyes on my practice. And one of the stumbling blocks in order to, you know, for me to get, to create more work and to create better work was that my assistants were always limited by the fact that they needed better source material in order to help me execute my paintings. I would do the drawing, I would do a study, and then, you know, I would give it to them and they would have to execute a larger version, or at least start on the larger version. But, you know, they're all younger painters. They're half my age or more, and they don't have this, they're not at the same level of skill where I've been doing this for so long. So that's where we were kind of reaching the stumbling block, and I was having to, you know, do so much of the paintings myself in terms of, you know, they would do the very basic undergrounds, and then I would spend, you know, 18 hours a day painting and painting and painting. It was getting burned out. You know, I was like, I'm not at that point yet where I can make a room full of paintings for Catherine de Medici. You know, I need to figure out how my team can assist me. So another stage, which is the compositional study, watercolor. So what we started doing, and I've used photography in the past, you know, I would sometimes photograph myself. If I needed, you know, Miss Chief in a certain pose, I would take a digital picture, and I would sometimes rely on photography, but I always thought, you know, it was a crutch. You know, I was such a purist. I was like, oh, you gotta just draw it and paint it, you know? But then I realized, well, my hero, Delacroix, you know, one of my heroes, was looking at photographs, was using photography, and a painter can use the photograph and but translate it into a painting. So that's what we decided to do, was to bring real models in, Indigenous people, bring them into the studio, stage a photograph, digital photograph, and then translate that into a painting. So we were able to find a way to create more work and to create better work, because now we have these original photographs that I've staged, I've lit, I've directed, and my staff now work with these digital images. And we work now in such a way that we all, every painter has an iPad. We're airdropping images all over the studio, and we have these very high-resolution digital photographs, which are then translated into these paintings. So you just saw the study. This is the final version. It's about 6 feet by 4 feet. Here's another painting that was in the Shame and Prejudice exhibition, just showing the process, the study, and the final version. So very quickly now, because we're already running a little late, but I just want to give you a quick overview of the Shame and Prejudice exhibition because did anyone see it? Oh, okay, we have a few people who saw it. Oh, that's awesome. It's touring right now. It's an incredible moment and opportunity for me to get this message out across the country. I think we're at our 5th venue right now. It's at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. It's actually going to come back into Ontario. I think Museum London is going to pick it up. It's going to travel out to BC and Winnipeg. But it's been phenomenal in terms of being able to communicate with Canadians and talk about what did the last 150 years mean to Indigenous people. And that was the whole point of this exhibition, was to really get Canadians to think about that period of time. What did those last 150 years mean? So when I thought about it, I thought, well, the last 150 years, we go back, roughly to that period of New France, and that's when Indigenous people were not dispossessed of their land yet. That was before the signing of the treaties. Indigenous people were players in the economy. The economy was this vibrant economy where the beaver was the currency of North America. It was the first currency, was beaver pelt. And Indigenous people were part of that. They were not dispossessed. And that's where I wanted the story to begin. So I sort of imagined that period of New France as this very, this time of bounty for Indigenous people. There were pelts, there were trade items. There was a time when Indigenous people were not dispossessed or starving. So I started to look at iconography from that period, and this image I loved. It's this European's, one person's kind of imagining of the beaver, how beaver lived, and I love that beaver condo. I call it a beaver condo. So I use that beaver condo, and so of course I kind of gave the beaver this kind of human quality. So here's this kind of very bloody scene of them being slaughtered. This is a Massacre of the Innocents, after those different Massacre of the Innocents paintings from art history. And then, I've been working with this idiom of the museum diorama for a number of years. I grew up in Manitoba, going to the Manitoba Museum and being kind of both mesmerized by these dioramas of First Nations people, but also kind of like disturbed by them because they were always kind of frozen in time, pre-contact. And I remember as a kid, like stepping out of the Manitoba Museum onto Main Street in Winnipeg. If anyone knows Winnipeg in the 70s, Main Street was a very, very bleak place. And you would see a lot of First Nations people falling out of the bars there, wasted in the middle of the day. And I remember my classmates, we'd go to the museum and they'd step outside and they'd look at me for some kind of answer, and I had no way to really reconcile, what had happened. Of course, this is the fallout of colonization. This is the fallout of many genocidal policies that have, destroyed Indigenous communities and families and individuals. But, fast forward a couple of years later, I've been able to figure out how to articulate that and how to talk about that, and that's what this exhibition was about. So Miss Chief here, it's based on Fragonard's painting The Swing, and Miss Chief represents, the Indigenous person sort of swinging between the French and the English here. So there are images of the beaver, this kind of bacchanal beaver. I found these amazing. This is something I created, a beaver rosary, so again, the influence of the church. There are a number of different themes. For those of you who didn't see it, in Shame and Prejudice, I sort of stitched together a number of different themes. The impact of Christianity, the theme of the book, and all of the didactic panels were written in Miss Chief's voice. So Miss Chief narrates this journey through this history of Canada, and Giselle Gordon, my collaborator, wrote those with me, and subsequently, we were approached to do a book. So Miss Chief's memoir is now being written. We're very close to finishing our manuscript, so that'll be released hopefully in about a year, but it sort of takes this idea and expands on it. And that's been an amazing and fun project to work on, because I didn't, you know, when I created Miss Chief, I didn't have the full story. I just kind of started somewhere and went with it. But now, as we've kind of reflected on the last 18 years or so, there's this incredible arc there. And so we've been filling in some of the blanks, and we had a lot of fun kind of coming up with her creation story, which I didn't really have before, but she comes from the stars. So here's a Rubens painting, which inspired my Beaver Bacchanal scene. I wanted a chapter that spoke about the railroad. You know, the railroad was so important in terms of the story of Canada, the bringing together of the different parts of Canada, but it also brought destruction to the Plains people, because the train brought, of course, thousands and thousands and thousands of settlers, and then it also brought about the decimation of the food source, which were the buffalo. So the table sort of goes from, we built the table itself becomes very desiccated as it kind of gets to the end of the table, and we have these images of starvation plates, which are archival photographs from the Glenbow Museum that show the mountains of bison bones, you know, so just the waste of the buffalo. This room was, devoted to the fathers of Confederation. So you can't talk about, the 150 years without talking about this moment. So, I knew that painting existed, or at least the copy of it. The original was burned in the House of Parliament during the fire, and so I managed to get this very small reproduction of that painting. And when I was at the Confederation Center in Charlottetown, I found Robert Harris, because Robert Harris created this painting, and I found a number of his studies. And in his studies, there was this little footstool in the foreground, and I thought, that empty space, that empty seat, really is for Miss Chief to represent, an Indigenous perspective at this meeting where the country was carved up. And so that was the perfect moment to perch her completely naked on that footstool. In this case, she's sitting on her own vintage of Chateau Miss Chief champagne, which she has distributed and got all these guys really wasted. Here are the studies. There was a series of photographs created for this exhibition where I imagined Miss Chief to be a different kind of a vixen from these biblical stories. This one is Delilah, Potiphar's wife, Salome, Judith, and Jezebel. So the rooms were themed accordingly. Here I imagine Miss Chief sort of summoning the spirit of the bears to help her with sort of take some vengeance or revenge, I guess, with these daddies and the bears. This room represented, this period where the signing of the treaties, where Indigenous people became wards of the state, and the subjugation of the Plains Cree chiefs, Poundmaker and Big Bear, who were essentially forced to surrender, starved. The people were starved. Miss Chief as a country wife with her boyfriend, John A. We exhibited a treaty, one of the treaties. We found Poundmaker's moccasins, which was also amazing. This room was maybe one of the most powerful rooms in the exhibition. It talked about, I wanted this chapter to go speak directly to residential schools and the impact of residential schools. And when I was thinking about that painting, I was like, how do I present that image? And for me, at the core of that was the removal of children, was that fracturing of family. And so, I read the TRC, and there were scenes that had described exactly the scene of forcible removal of children. The forcible transfer of children from one cultural group to another is a definition of genocide. So I knew this room had to have a very powerful painting. And, you know, again, I was going back to the Massacre of the Innocents. If anyone knows the art history, you know, Rubens has done a version, Poussin has done a version, and it was based on the story of King Herod, who had all the babies in Bethlehem slaughtered because he was threatened by those, you know, the king of the Jews was going to come up and usurp his role. So there is a violence in these images of children being ripped from their parents and families. You know, I didn't really, you know, as an artist, you're in the ideas, you're thinking about just making the work. You're not really thinking about the impact it's going to have. But, you know, I have a Miss Chief Facebook page, and I have a Kent Monkman studio page, and we posted this on the Miss Chief page maybe a week before the exhibition opened, expecting to get, you know, a couple hundred views or likes or whatever. Well, this painting just went viral. In a week, we had 300,000 views. And that, you know, really made me realize that for the first time, there was this image that represented this very violent act. People had heard stories, people were just starting to learn about it through the TRC, but it's an image that people hadn't seen before or really even imagined. So it really, you know, resonated for people from all walks of life, because it's a very hard thing to imagine. When I was thinking about the museum objects for that room, I found these cradle boards, which are these beautiful cradle boards made by mothers, by grandmothers for children. And because of conservation issues, we weren't able to borrow as many. I kind of imagine, you know, an entire room, just a grid of many of them, but we were only able to borrow about 12 or 8 actually. And so, but that, in a way, that restriction kind of forced me to be creative about how I could represent that room. And in many ways, it's more effective to see these ghost boards. I made ghost boards and drew chalk lines and created blanks to represent the missing children. So one of the chapters was on the Res house. And this was an opportunity to speak directly to the impact of Christianity. So that Res house was it was based on a German Renaissance painting of a nativity scene. You know, that you see my head on all these figure sculptures. There's a reason for that. I was in the Museum of Natural History a number of years ago, and you know, that museum is still in the dark ages in terms of how they represent Native American people. They basically use one head, one male face, standardize all of, you know, North America, all indigenous North America. So I started using my own head on my figure sculptures. I went to the Jesuit archives, and I found this book, a journal by a Jesuit priest who was also an artist, and I found his work fascinating. So I was able to exhibit these works alongside my own paintings and sculptures, and they speak about, you know, this profound sort of Christian view of the world, and then you also see the indigenous dwellings. Even the baby has my head, which is kind of creepy. Of course, Miss Chief's praying hands. One of the chapters was on sickness and healing. So here we have, I found a very creepy sort of nurse's bag to contrast traditional medicine and traditional healing with Western science. The urban res was an important part of that exhibition, because it really reflected on the impact of European modernity. You know, essentially the last 150 years are that period that run concurrently with European modernity and the values of European modernity, and therefore modernism, you know, the art form itself. So I really wanted to reflect on that period of art history, because it was a kind of, you know, moving away from traditions and a deconstructing of the painterly language. So you know, I was looking at paintings by Picasso and the Cubists and the flattening of pictorial space, and I was thinking about that flattening of pictorial space as a metaphorical way to talk about the flattening of cultures, and how that European modernity, you know, bringing those values to North America was a reductive force in terms of how Indigenous people got, how we've been reduced to smaller and smaller pieces of land, but also how we've struggled to keep our languages and culture. There were 3 animals that ran through the exhibition in terms of themes of the bear, the bison, and the beaver. These scenes in Winnipeg really speak to kind of the vibrant spirituality, even though Indigenous people live in cities, still connected to spirituality and culture. Another chapter was on incarceration, the disproportionate numbers of Indigenous people in our prisons. These were photographs from the Glenbow archives of the capture and arrest of Poundmaker and Big Bear, which I found devastating. You can see, if you look closely, you can see their leg irons on them. This is Stony Mountain Penitentiary, just outside of Winnipeg. So just wrapping up, I'm just going to show you some of my new work. These are paintings called from the Protectors series. So really wanting to authorize Indigenous histories from the past and the present. The fact that, at Standing Rock, you could see the army coming in and attacking the sacred stone camp, and the teepees were present, and those images looked so similar to when the U.S. cavalry marched in into Wounded Knee and slaughtered, Native people. So for me, it was very much about acknowledging the struggle and the resistance continues. The current series is on display right now, actually, in Toronto. I've got one of my art dealers has an exhibition of this work at 65 George Street, Pierre-François Ouellette. It's center space. And with this body of work, I wanted to create paintings that could speak about, that institutionalization of Indigenous people into these institutions like foster care, prisons, healthcare, how Indigenous people have been brought into these colonial institutions and how they are still affected by them, and to try and communicate the psychological impact of being colonized. This is, I'm just going to wrap it up with this painting. So this is kind of where, I just continue with my program to authorize into art history, but I was approached by a good friend of mine who is the director of the Poundmaker Museum in Saskatchewan on the Poundmaker Reserve, and he asked me if I would make a painting for their museum because Poundmaker, who had been arrested and incarcerated at Stony Mountain, was charged with treason, and the community had him exonerated this year, so cleared of all charges. So it was a turning point for that community because they were able to celebrate his life with the opening of this museum. And Floyd asked me to make a painting. So Floyd, I've known him for many years, and he's a theater director, and so we talked about the different, which part of that story did we want to communicate? So the Canadian Army, General Otter had sort of in this unprovoked attacked Poundmaker's camp, and about 40 warriors were able to fight off about 350 Mounties, and they had them surrounded. They had the Mounties surrounded in a coulee, and Poundmaker was not the war chief, he was the political chief, and the warriors had basically rearmed, and they were going to go back and finish off these Mounties that they had trapped, and Poundmaker stopped them. And so that was the moment that I felt needed to be authorized. The fact that Poundmaker is actually a Canadian hero. And with all the tearing down of monuments of the colonizers, Justice Sinclair said, well, instead of doing that, we should really be elevating our own heroes. And this is what I wanted to do with this painting, was to elevate one of our leaders, one of our heroes. So I'm going to end the formal part of the presentation there. I think there's a few minutes, 1 or 2 questions, 1 or 2 only. will try to answer your questions. You know, sometimes I get asked, what can we do as Canadians? Well, you know, there's a couple things. Read the TRC report. It's important for all Canadians to understand the history and to read these testimonies, to read the reports, and also read the calls to action. That's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is to elect politicians that make the right choices in terms of the relationship with Indigenous people. You know, we want to move forward with Canadians. One question there.
How do you grapple with the complexity of encouraging art students to be learning these classic techniques that are generally European, and you're learning about dead white men's paintings, which you're saying you need those skills in order to make use of this very moving medium, with the need to raise up non-European artistic practices. And I think this is an issue not just in art history, but in music and in lots of other areas where there's this struggle.
So the question is, how do I grapple with that, I guess that a bit of a contradiction in terms of how, why is it an Indigenous artist working with a European vocabulary of art making, whether it's painting or music or writing? Well, I think the answer to that question is, we need to be able to communicate in a language that people will understand. And I have a lot of admiration for the old masters in the European painting, because it was so adept at being able to communicate so many very complex ideas, human emotion, and things like that. I mean, you have Indigenous people now who are writing symphonies, who are writing operas, who write novels. It's not a question of the medium, it's the message in the medium. And I think that's really, when I look at the other Indigenous artists that I aspire to, or that admire and inspired by, they are masterful in communicating. Whether it's Zacharias Canuck and his cinematic language. Obviously, that came from a European technology and invention, but he's able to transform that and make that into an Indigenous language. And I see myself basically taking a medium and making it an Indigenous medium. I don't see it as a European medium anymore. I've made it into my own Cree way of making a painting.
So you have a book coming out, which is fabulous. What can we hope to see from Kent Monkman in the next 5 years? Where do you hope to be, and what do you hope to press upon?
So the question is, I have a book coming out, but where do I see Kent Monkman in 5 years? Retired. No, I'm kidding. It's hard to say. Like I've really ramped up my studio to something that is producing what I think is like really phenomenal work. It's very hard to maintain that level of energy, because to employ 12 people means that works have to be sold and money has to come in order to pay everybody, because no one works for me for free, and they're very talented people. So it's all about maintaining that momentum. And I have different ideas about where I see the work going, but I really feel like I've found my own language of painting, and I feel like there's a long list of these Indigenous experiences, both historical and contemporary, that I still have yet to kind of approach. So there's a long list of things that I want to get to. I'm with my studio, and we're in conversation with a couple of different other institutions about possible projects. There's always stuff kind of coming up, but I'm just going to keep doing it. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kent. Two of the most popular subject streams at the School of Continuing Studies are visual arts and history. And Kent, you have helped us consider visual art today, not only as an examination of works that are beautiful, but also as a lens that can change our perspective on ourselves and our surroundings. And I think you've helped us understand history better as a way that not only shows us how we lived in the past, but how we can share a better future in this land that we live in together. So thank you very much.